Welcome to Hochoka Podcast.
Many are familiar with the declaration in Romans chapter 8, verse 31, "If God is for us, who can be against?" This bold and rhetorical question is subject to many considerations, but for oppressed peoples seeking to interpret Christian scripture, it can be problematic. Let's unpack the issue. Hello, Madaki Api. Welcome to Hochoka here at the center of St. Joseph's Indian Schools campus. I'm Scott Wooster, your Hochoka host. We're glad you joined our circle with Dr. Chris Hocklatuby, who is with us today for another fresh perspective on Christianity through an Indigenous lens. Welcome, Chris. Good to have you here.
Oh, it's good to be here. Thank you, Yakoki, for having me here.
Mm-hmm. So what we kind of tend to do when the two of us get together is I ask questions, and then we ferret out different parts of Indigenous culture and the scripture. And today we're going to tackle kind of a tricky subject, maybe a thorny subject. And you're going to introduce me and our audience to something that we may not be familiar with. There's an essay by a writer named Robert Allen Warrior that you're very familiar with. Mm-hmm. It's called Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indians. So for the audience that may not be familiar, for me that doesn't know that much about it, just fill us in a little bit. What conflict is set up through this? What is it, and what conflict is there?
Yeah. Oh, it's a fantastic essay, and if you're in a seminary class, this might be the one essay that you're introduced to that brings together Indigenous perspectives and biblical scripture. So okay. It's a classic text that introduces the problem, and he says that the God of liberation is also the God of oppression. Mm-hmm. That is to say that as God goes to liberate a people, well, that liberation comes at the cost of another people who they're being liberated from. And in our stories, it's oftentimes easy to tell flat stories of good versus evil. It gets tricky when we tell the story about the Canaanites and God promising land to the Israelites, that this land has been theirs and promised to them, that land that they had not touched for 200-something years while they were in Egypt. So, Deuteronomy offers this promise and this promise is stated many times, but that I am bringing you to a land that is filled with milk and honey, that there's fig trees and pomegranates and vineyards, all kind of wonderful things. And the purpose of the statement is to say that you need to remember that this is gift. It's promised, but it's a gift, and you need to treat it humbly because it can be taken away from you. But what's missing from this is that vineyards don't take care of themselves. Pomegranate trees don't cultivate themselves, that the wheat doesn't put itself in nice rows. All of this is because there was an indigenous people there taking care of this. And for Robert Warrior, he says it's really difficult for an indigenous person like himself to read this story and not feel resonance with the indigenous people, the Canaanites of this land, who were going about their lives, and then this other tribal people comes through and begins taking over, or in his perspective, colonizing this land in the name of liberation or in the name of being given a promised gift. Mm-hmm. And historians look at this story and they know that it's much more complicated than this flat reading. And Robert Warrior knows this too, and he even lists it out. So for example, our archaeological records don't give evidence of a massacre of a people. Right, we don't see all this destruction or a layer of fire or burnt. We actually see an integration of wares, of cultural pottery that seems to suggest that this was much more of an integrative process. We also have stories like in Joshua that says that everyone was killed, and God commands everyone to be killed. But then the Canaanites are continuing to be there throughout the rest of the stories of Kings and Samuel, because the Israelites continue to fight against them. So you can't have them all wiped out but then also them be the classical enemy of the Israelite people. And what we find from a historical biblical perspective is that these stories are really complex, and a lot of them were re-remembered and edited while the Israelites were in Babylon, trying to tell and remember a national story to give them hope and to give them strength and identity and dignity while they were a displaced, landless, and powerless people by the rivers of Babylon. So, and then we see this across multiple peoples, right? We tell these heroic stories to build us up when we are struggling. And so he says, I know all this. And yet the story that keeps being told, though, nonetheless, is not those stories. We don't complicate it. We don't talk about how the indigenous people are integrated in the Israelites. We tell the flat story of this heroic story of the Israelites coming in and beating this flatly evil, deficient people. And we're told that they deserve it because they are idolatrous and all these other things. And that story has a tragic reception history, a tragic legacy, insofar as it has been used historically, metaphorically, and symbolically to justify the taking of land that seems to be a gift to the conquering people while erasing the people actually already on this land, and in particular in the United States. So as pilgrims and the colonists come in, you know, one of the things that Conor Mathers and all these early preachers do is they talk about the United States as being this promised land, this gift. And if the promised land is a gift to them, the inverse is there is a dehumanized people that's either been erased or that are easily set aside or removed so that they can enjoy, the colonists can enjoy this gift. And for Robert Warrior, he says, Indigenous people and even Indigenous Christians can be forgiven for not seeing themselves in the story or wanting to not really relate to this story, let alone even to find their understanding of God from these scriptures that seem to justify the displacement and erasure of Indigenous people.
So I see that with the folks that I have worked with for 32 years, folks that have been colonialized, that have been victims of this oppression. They look at this Judeo-Christian story and they may not find that home there. So the question is, how have Scripture scholars such as yourself attempted to respond to that issue that Warrior does raise?
Yeah.
What do we do about it?
So the response has been that in response to one story, you continue to tell more stories. And more stories have come up. So Jace Weaver, a Cherokee literary scholar, says that this Robert Warrior's work was really deeply moving to him. And I think all the responses I'm going to name, they all show their utmost appreciation for the brilliance of Robert Warrior. And so this is not antagonistic. This is saying, you have some really good points here, and we need to wrestle with this, and made them wrestle with their faith. Jace Weaver says that as we continue to read the Hebrew Bible, there are other little stories that oftentimes we don't look to or think much about that actually give us a little hope in this. So one is a story from Numbers where there is this person named Zelophehad. He has these daughters, and he dies, and his daughters, when they're looking over the distribution of land, are saying, hey, you can't forget about us. Like, even though we're not men, we still are entitled to some land because our father would have given us this land. And they bring this up to Moses, and you have all the men leaders coming to talk about this, and they're like, they don't count for this, but they advocate for themselves in this beautiful moment of justice. And Moses goes to God and brings this up to God, and God says, they have a point. Give them the land. Give them their fair distribution of this promised land. What's interesting is that each of these daughters actually have names that represent Canaanite towns. So they're not Israel names. These are Canaanite indigenous names. And so there's even maybe this hint of a story of a remembering that there was this integration of Canaanites and Israelites. And we have a story of Canaanite women who are quite vulnerable, advocating for themselves and finding full legitimization and dignification by God itself to Moses. So Chase Weaver points out this story. Others will go to the story of the Canaanite woman in the New Testament. So there's this fun story. Jesus needs a break. So he goes across the Sea of Galilee to a town where he's hoping nobody knows his name. Kind of the reverse of Cheers.
Yeah, exactly.
He goes into a bar and I like to joke, he probably ordered some water and annoyed the bartenders, and he turned that into wine and gave it to his friends, right? Free drinks, right? But he's sitting there to relax, hoping nobody recognizes him, and he feels a tap on his shoulder. And he's like, oh gosh. And this woman says, hey, aren't you Jesus? And I have a daughter that is possessed by a demon. I need your help. I need you to exorcise this demon from my daughter. And Jesus, whether he's exhausted, it's unclear in this text, but he has a really surprising response to this desperate woman. And he says, look, I've come here for the children of Israel. I haven't come for your people. Is it fair to give the bread that's meant for the children to the dogs? And we'll put an asterisk on that. We'll come back to that, right? And she responds in a very clever way that, well, even dogs get scraps from the table. And then Jesus responds, your word is true. He validates her statement, her argument, and then moves to say, well, because of your word, your daughter is healed. Go now in peace. So we oftentimes kind of go through this story. For someone like Homer Noli, a Methodist Choctaw minister, he says, well, we see this redemption of a Canaanite woman in this story. Matthew calls her a Syro-Phoenician. But it's this ethnic woman who's not a part of Israel, and she has her daughter healed. She is brought into the Jesus story. Robert Warrior will look at this, and others will be like, but he still called her a dog. Is this really what we are? We get the scraps of the table. This still isn't that satisfying or even compelling of a Jesus story. Robert Warrior also sees Chase Weaver's argument and says, well, that's a cute story too, but again, they're not fully integrated. They're still second-class citizens in both of these stories. Is this really compelling? And, my response to all this is I think that these stories have a plural, they have many meanings to them.
Yeah.
And that's the richness of these stories. And it's probably good to sit with these stories. It's good to have that tension. Yep. Because the story of Israel isn't fixed to one moment of promised land. And there are many other stories we can point to, and even archaeological records, like I already talked about, that show the integrated nature of the Canaanites and the Israelites. And that's a whole nother podcast. But I think the answer is to tell richer stories and to keep telling more and more stories, with always the goal that we get to a world where, to play off a Jesus phrase, that there are no dogs, that everyone is a child and is brought in here. My particular take on this story, thinking about what I've learned and appreciated from my Lakota friends and my friends in the Southwest, is this deep appreciation for this character called what we could call broadly the sacred clown, the Heyoka, or the clown in the Hopi tradition. And the idea of these figures is that they say things that are offensive. They say things that shock. They do things countercultural. And by these performative statements, it makes you take a moment and think about what you take for granted. And it maybe sometimes makes you take a moment to think, oh, this thing I'm taking for granted, the thing I take and do habitually, I could do this otherwise. Or in this story, I would say, there's a really perverse logic to this that I'm living in. And he says that he's effectively saying the quiet part out loud of this ethnic hierarchy that many of his time are living with. And by saying the quiet part out loud, you're able to see the frankly disturbing part of it. And what these moments and performatives do, they invite a response from the audience. They invite a response from the listener. And what I find compelling about Indigenous readings of the Bible is that it invites us to move the spotlight onto different characters. And by moving the spotlight on the agency and the figure of the woman, we see this woman who's in a vulnerable state speak back to Jesus. She owns her voice, corrects him, or through her wit and humor, says a word that ultimately Jesus says, it's your word, it's your logos, it's that heals your daughter. And I think that's really a beautiful, inspiring story that we could just kind of sit with, and also appreciate the way in which Indigenous ceremonial figures can provide us a pattern, provide us a model to just another way to think with. We'll never know fully. This is a story. We can't get into the mind of Jesus. We can't get into the mind of the authors of how they interpreted this. I will say we know that in stories that people told about ancient philosophers, this was something philosophers would do. They would do ridiculous things to elicit responses that then lead to new moments of revelation. And we see this in Zen Buddhism. Like, as a scholar of religion, we know that there are characters in religious history that do ridiculous things, that in the absurdity of it produces a new revelation that moves us forward to balance and harmony. So whether this is a fully satisfying response to Warrior, responding, thinking about Warrior's story brought me to this story to think more holistically about it and produce my own new revelation about the Canaanite story. And so I'm putting this together now, but in some ways, Warrior story, I don't want to say it's foolish or a sacred clown, because but the tension it provokes, I think, invites deeper reflection and some medicine in it. And it's good. So I don't want to solve the Warrior problem. I don't want to call it the problem, but I don't think we solve it. I think we tell more stories and we wrestle with it, and that produces growth.
Yeah, you said it's. I don't know if it's satisfying. Well, that might be beside the point. The point is that it was a living story then, and it's a living story now.
Yes.
And my current favorite Bible scholar gets to come in here and continue to create that and make it a living story and explain it in that way, which is dynamite. And you may change your mind about it next week, and I might as well, which is perfect, which is great stuff. You and I, when we get together, we have great conversations, and hopefully that we're keeping these stories alive. I think that's your hope with all of this, and that both of us continue to learn something from it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yakoki, and I appreciate this time here. Absolutely.
And it's good to have you here. We'd like to thank our audience for joining us here today at Ho-Chokeh at the center of St. Joseph's Indian Schools campus, where we talk about issues that are central to Native American education today. Until next time, stay centered.